Greetings to our valued RRS members. We are delighted to have you here on this wonderful Friday. Today we have the pleasure of hosting past RRS President Dr. Charles Limoli and Dr. Janet Bausch. The format for today will consist of a presentation from Dr. Limoli covering topics regarding grants and funding for research, then followed by questions from anyone attending. Please post these questions to the right in the chat section. But first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bausch. She is currently a project scientist in the Department of Radiation Oncology at UC Irvine and has successfully navigated the funding landscape and received funding from Department of Energy, Low Dose Program, NASA, and DTRA. Passing it over to you, ma'am.
All right, great. Hi, everybody. Sorry for that. As Jordan said, this is Janet coming to you from sunny Southern California and UC Irvine. Thanks for joining us in this next installment of the Radiation Research Society webinar series. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy and sane during this strange time we're in. As he mentioned, today our speaker is going to be Dr. Charles Limoli. Charlie is Professor and Vice Chair of Research and Academic Affairs in the Department of Radiation Oncology here at UC Irvine. He's made significant contributions to the field of radiation biology throughout his career, including his early days looking at oxidative stress and genomic instability, through to his more recent work with stem cells, and now looking at the effects of both clinically and space-relevant radiation exposures on the CNS. His most recent work has led to a PO1 award that's looking at the ability of cutting-edge high dose rate flash radiation a clinical therapeutic paradigm and the ability of that flash radiation exposure to spare normal tissue injury in not only the CNS, but brain, lungs, heart, and other organs of the body. So now, without further ado, I will turn this meeting over to Charlie and let him talk to us about strategies for success with NIH funding.
All right, so I'm just popping in to say hello to everyone from my home here in sunny Irvine. It's not often that I have to give a talk about, or present about the funding landscape. I'm not a program officer, but I can provide a brief overview of some areas of the radiation research program from the NIH and NCI. And what I'd really like to get into later is I assume that most of you out there are relatively early in your career. And I'd like to give you, at least from my perspective, some helpful hints on preparing grants that I think you'll find useful. Now, I'm well aware that there's a lot of grant writing workshops, and I'm not going to bore you with a lot of tedious detail. I'll just cut to the chase and give you what I think are the key elements of preparing a competitive grant application. So with that, I'm going to take my video off so you can focus on the slides. And so before we get into the meat of the talk, I'd just like to highlight that there's other ways to learn about the Radiation Research Society and radiation science. If you go to our website, you'll see there's a member discussion forum that talks about everything from women in science to early career investigators to our least favorite topic of the day, the coronavirus. And we're going to have a journal club coming up. You can follow the society on a variety of social media websites, Facebook, etc. There's also other vodcasts and podcasts through YouTube that you can tune into. We've made a lot over the years, and you can look at what we've done over the past and what's coming up. And certainly like to make a nice pitch for Manuela, who's done a nice job with the Radiation Research Education Center, which you can access from the website. We've posted a lot of material that's informative at every level. So if you really want to learn more about certain aspects of radiation science, that's a good place to start. So don't forget about the Radiation Research website. It's a nice resource. So as we move on, I'd just like to kind of and I'm not going to talk through each of these slides at the start in great detail because they'll be at your disposal. As you can see, the NCI works through a number of avenues and works with a number of organizations, as you can see here, everyone from the World Health Organization, which is up front and central these days, to NASA, to the NIAID, to the radiation research program that really involves the radiotherapy development branch, the clinical radiation oncology branch, and the molecular radiation therapeutics branch. And these first few slides I'd like to acknowledge I received from Doctors Prasanna and Ahmed, and I'd like to thank them now for providing some of these. And so this kind of gives you an overview of the different interactions between the agencies. I know a lot of you who come to our meetings are funded by NASA or the Defense Threat Reduction Agency or NIAID. I know that Andy gave an earlier webinar on Wednesday this week. So you have a lot of options outside of just the NCI, for example, and the NIH to apply for your funding. And more specifically, if you look at what the various branches and the programs are to interact with the radiation research program, you can see that there's the small business grants you can apply for with an industry partner, and all the other areas that may be more or less specific to your specific research emphasis. So these are the programs that cover, everything from, cancer imaging to basic biology to more preclinical and clinical development that you might want to get involved with. And so when you think about how to apply to these various programs and branches under the umbrella of the radiation research program, you're going to use one of these mechanisms. And so I know many of you are familiar with some of these awards, but I can just go through them in general. If you look at the top, we have the really the training awards, the F-type awards that are available for the pre-doctoral, postdoctoral, and senior fellows to help them get on their way in their research careers. And another important mechanism are the Type K awards, which are the early career development awards. And so these are for people that are just starting out. They're valuable resources for not only the PI, but the awardee. And it gives you a nice bit of money to develop your niche in the research world. Below that, there's a program project, which takes a bit more effort. These are for projects that involve a series of usually 3 to 4 to 5 investigators, all focused on a topical area of research that tends to be relatively higher impact. For most of you, you'll be applying for Type R awards, and specifically the R01, which is really what I'm going to focus the latter half of my talk on. There's conference grants, R13s, that I've applied for to get funding for the Radiation Research Society from the NIH. But really the grant mechanisms that are most useful to you would be the R01s and the R21s. And then after the Type R awards, there are the more cooperative agreement awards, which are the Type U. So with these types of awards, and why I'm going to focus on the R01, you can see here that the majority of funding is really through the R01 mechanisms, accounting for basically 75% of funding from the radiation oncology group. R21s account for the next biggest chunk, and then all the other programs are relatively minor in comparison. And so as you start pondering your submission and you start pondering how to apply for an R01, I'll put up a slightly dated slide that shows you kind of the areas now that have, at least by 2017 and into 2018, where this money has gone. And you can see this is pretty representative of all the areas of the radiation science, spanning from physics to chemistry to preclinical to clinical work. And it's the opportunities for funding your research. This is not meant to be exclusionary in any way. It just shows you that basically all aspects of radiation science are funded by the radiation research program. Okay, so moving on, I want to highlight a couple of the gaps in the current portfolio. And this, again, is a year old, but it does point to some areas if you're thinking about developing your niche, what the NCI at least has identified as areas that are of importance. You can see here the biomarkers of radiation response, and looking at how omics and circulating tumor cells could be readouts of that are certainly things I think are worthwhile to pursue. Obviously, the the groups are interested in preclinical studies that focus on mechanism of action, especially now with the impact of immunotherapy in our field, looking at the mechanisms, how the immune response can be tailored to enhance the therapeutic ratio for tumor cure. And obviously there's a number of different avenues you can approach your preclinical work to get funded. Some relatively new areas that have popped up that really weren't around when I first got in the field are looking at how manipulations or changes to the microbiome affect the radiation response. I think this is a really fascinating area, a bit intimidating to a traditional radiation biologist like myself, but if you have some background in microbiology, it could provide a nice inroad into studying some interesting radiation effects. Some of the other things down later are a little bit more physics oriented. There's always a need for accurate and real-time dosimetry. There's an interest in radionucleotide therapies. I was at a workshop later last year on that, and there's a lot of interesting work to be done there. Obviously, an interest in particle beam dosimetry as we all try to figure out what the RBEs or protons are still, and how we might implement heavier ions for the treatment of tumors. And then the use of microRNA therapeutics is something I'm particularly interested in, and I think there's a lot of opportunities there investigating how single or combination microRNAs can impact a whole bunch of signaling pathways in cells that impact the radiation response of tissues and organs. And lastly, something also that is really starting to become topical in our field is machine learning. You can apply this now to physics, dose painting, the analysis of histology, really anything. And in the end, if done properly and with the proper training and people involved, this is an area that can really save your lab a lot of time. And I can tell you that we're going to be putting a bit of interest in effort into this in our lab. And I would encourage people to really consider taking a machine learning algorithm approach to doing some of their data analysis in an unbiased way and saving themselves a lot of time in the lab. So anyway, those are the gaps. And I'd like to finish up with this overview of the NIH and highlight something that I was relatively unaware of until a few years ago. And this has to do with these molecular radiation therapeutics working groups. And what these working groups are, as you can see here, are forums for the discussion of clinical translation of a variety of things we work on as biologists and in the preclinical realm. And as you can see, they really cover a lot of interesting areas from colorectal cancer to sarcoma to immune modulation. And I was most recently involved this last year with the last one on the right with the grid lattice, flash, and microbeam radiotherapy MRT group. And really what this boils down to is having really meetings once a month that are mediated by the chairs of a specific session. And it allows you to do two things. It allows you to actively participate in the group. It allows you to learn about how the preclinical realm can get translated to the clinical realm. And it allows you to pick up some new information. And I don't think that any of these are exclusionary in the sense that they would welcome anyone to join. You just really need to contact the given chairs or give one of the program officers such as Pat Monsoor or Norm Coleman a call. And I'm sure they'd be happy to let you participate in these. And it was pretty informational for me. I found it useful. And in the end, what comes out of these are usually workshop reports and a path forward. And so I think, and as you think about how to integrate your research and move towards the clinic, this can be an avenue that I think you would all find very helpful. So given that backdrop now, I'd like to take some of my past experience, if I could be so bold, maybe say expertise, and try to help some of the people hone some of their grant skills in preparing a competitive extramural grant application. So listen, there's 100 ways to go about this, and I'm aware of that. And so I'm really going to focus here now on the NIH and R01 application. And each agency, NASA, DTRA, will have a specific format that may differ from this, but I think I'm going to present a series of rules or at least formalisms that I think will be helpful in any grant application. And I really think that I've followed these over the years, and it's proven helpful to me, and I hope it will prove helpful to you. So a couple of obvious things to start. So you're sitting in front of your desk. You've had 3 or 4 cold beers on a Friday, and you're going to go home in the weekend, and you're thinking about doing a grant Monday. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to put your beer down, glass of wine, and you're going to read the RFA when you're nice and calm and familiarize yourself with the critical details. Look at what the emphasis of the call is, okay? If you're outside that emphasis, needless to say, this is never going to work. Familiarize yourself with the due dates. Figure out what the budget limitations are, because that's really going to dictate how much you can do. And for the most part, that's $250K per year for the modular budgets that most of us apply for. Look at if there's any specific exclusions. Oftentimes RFAs, and it's not obvious, will say no clinical trial or only clinical trial allowed. So this is important. Okay, so all of that's fairly obvious. The next one isn't so obvious, and I can't stress this enough. You need to get to know your program officer. This person is your conduit to the realm of the NIH, and they are there to help, and they're there to save you time. And I have found in every instance them to be invaluable resources moving forward. If you don't get to know your program officer, you're really doing yourself a disservice, and it's really putting you at a handicap. So I would put that as one of the take-home messages of this webinar. All right, so now you've started to think about the science. Okay, so what do you do? What do I do to kind of expedite this process? Okay, so one thing you want to do is you want to collect all the administrative information. This is the boring phase of the grant, but we all have to do it. You need to get the internal, external budget justifications together. You need to get your biosketch, your facilities, all the stuff you have at your disposal at your university. Get this together as soon as you can and send it into the office, the dean's office, the office of sponsored projects, so you don't have to worry about it as you start grinding through the science. You want to kind of get this off the table, okay? And then you're going to have to start thinking about what I have here in my second blue bullet point, the grant structure, okay? So as a rule of thumb, when you're thinking about your grant, be it R21 or R01, half your grant should be the experimental plan. Okay, so for a 12-page R01, I typically target preliminary data being 3 to 4 pages. Everything else, so the significance, the innovation, scientific premise, introduction, right, has to go in the remaining pages, which is really 2.5 pages. When you prepare your introduction, you don't want to review the entire literature. Get to the point. So when you prepare your application, simpler is better, and nothing irritates a reviewer more to read 50 acronyms in the first paragraph. That's not going to fly. Almost every grant I've ever reviewed is overambitious, so that's okay, but just don't make it obvious. If you're proposing to analyze 3,000 or 4,000 mice in the first year, that's not going to work. So keep it simple. So you've thought about the science, and now you have the first stage, and this is the most important stage of the grant. You got to nail the specific aims page. So if the reviewer doesn't like this one page, nothing else is going to happen. So one of the things you need to ask yourself and you know, and your team as you put this together, does your specific aims page address an important gap in knowledge or controversy? This will define the significance of your grant. Does it propose a straightforward and overarching hypothesis? You should put that in a single and simple sentence. Do the aims address the hypothesis? And I'll tell you, surprisingly, a number of grants fall short on this critical point. If you've got aims that don't address the hypothesis, the reviewers are going to sniff it out. And lastly, is the approach innovative? Now, this is the hard part. You have to ask yourself, what do you bring to the tables that most other labs cannot? If the answer to that's nothing, then this is going to be a tough grant to get funded. You have got to be able to tell the reviewers why they should fund your work. And a lot of times this will always fall back onto what is your creative or innovative angle that you're going to take to the table. And this really also feeds into the significance of your grant. Lastly, and then this may be less obvious to some, but or whatever, you want to make the aims independent, but obviously they're interlinked. It's in the same proposal. I mean, so what I'm saying here is, if the first aim of your grant fails or doesn't measure up to your expectations, you don't want the rest of your grant to completely fall apart. And this is a common mistake, and the reviewers look for this as well. So now, after you're past the first stage, you really need to polish the aims, and you have your general ideas now, and so the best grants now that I've reviewed use combinations of approaches. They do in vitro for mechanistic work. They combine that with some in vivo studies and or some clinical samples or some clinical trials. Obviously, some of the aims need to address the underlying mechanisms to your hypothesis. The other thing that's less obvious, and this can certainly vary depending on your proposal, is that you want to carefully think about the order of your experimentation. If you propose a lot of mechanistic studies without a clear functional consequence, it has much less impact. I always like the grants where they have a well-defined functional outcome and then developed a mechanistic basis to tease that out. So for an R01, I don't like to see, when I review grants, much more than 4 aims. And for the aims, simple sentences are best. For an R21, so this is a 2-year grant, don't propose more than 2 aims, okay? So now, moving on, let's go through the rest of the application briefly. Your significance statement is important, probably the next most important outside of your specific aims page. You want to be succinct. You don't want to drone on, and this can be no more than typically a half page. Then you have your innovation, as I alluded to before. You want to specifically state what is unique about your proposal. Don't go past a paragraph on this. For your introduction, it's typically 1 to 1.5 pages. It does not have to be a review of the literature. It has to present the studies that support the importance of your study, okay? Now, we'll come to the experimental plan. For the experimental plan, again, I want you to state the aims, provide a brief rationale, and the overall approach. Important specifics will include things that I would look for in the experimental plan: the number of cell lines, their origin, number of mice, the sex, the strain. Carefully define the cohort so people don't have to guess. Too many experimental details do not help. I don't need to know how you're going to perfuse your animals or how you're going to culture your cells unless there's a specific trick involved. The other thing that's often, so look, the experimental details are the things you should be able to write up, but you need to put them in the proper context. Then the last thing that you need to do, and take a step back after you put your experimental plan together and have a good honest look at the limitation and expectation section. And I can tell you that nothing irritates me and many other reviewers more than if you've proposed a complicated series of experimental studies and then say, we don't anticipate any problems. So, I mean, that's just not going to work. Let them know. We're people too when we review these grants. So highlight the expectations and highlight the limitations. If the reviewers pick out a limitation that you did not, it oftentimes could be a critical flaw. So as you near the end of the road, outside of contacting your program officer, which is key point number 1, this would probably be, of course, not underscoring the importance of the science itself, the next most important thing. So the 3 due dates for the NIH coming up in, what are they? February, June, September, depending if it's new or renewal. You're going to have your grant nearly complete. Everyone hopefully has these done months before. Obviously, that never happens. It doesn't happen for me either. So realistically, 2 weeks before it's due, you need to have somebody else read your grant. It really is critical. So my approach is typically giving it to 2 different types of scientists. The first one would be someone that knows the details, at least in part, of what you do. If your grant's on immunotherapy, give it to someone familiar with the immune system. If your grant's on, kidney failure, you need to give it to someone familiar with some aspect of kidney work, etc. This person's going to help you identify any potential critical flaws, which hopefully at that point you've caught, but they really may be able to help with some critical ideas. The other one that I think is actually more important is to have someone that's outside of your field of expertise read it, because this is going to be at least 50% of your grant reviewers. When you submit your grant, you're going to have 3 to 4 people review your application. For sure, you'll have an expert, but there's no way they'll all be experts in this. So if this non-expert has a good read through your grant and likes it, then that's good. But if they read through it and the non-expert can't understand what the heck you're trying to do, I can guarantee you your grant's doomed. You have to write this grant so it's universally understandable by a scientist, okay? And so if you get to the end in your submission, you submit this to the NIH and no one else but you has read it, I almost guarantee it won't get funded. So I would strongly encourage you to bring in somebody else to give you a good critical read. All right. So some final thoughts. I've been yammering on here. We're almost at the end of our talk. We can keep on for some questions. So some of these may be obvious, but maybe not. Complicated, overambitious grants rarely get funded. They are typically refined over several cycles of revision. The process at the NIH is fair, but imperfect and slow. So that said, it's still the system we have at the moment, so don't complain about it and just learn how to write a better grant. And the best way to learn how about writing grants is to actively participate in the study section. So if you're ever invited by a program officer, you need to accept. It's the best way to learn how the system works from the other side. Really, that's important. The better you get involved with the study section, you can hear how people review grants, and it's really going to be to your long-term benefit. Lastly, and my favorite point, don't try to impress people and reviewers with how smart you are. We don't care. We just want to know whether you can do the work you proposed. Okay, so that's pretty much all I want to say. I do want to end on a positive note. We have a very nice meeting that's still a go at the moment for Hawaii later in the year. I'm planning to go. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone in Hawaii. I think it'll be a great meeting. I've seen some of the program, not all of it. I really do think it's really just the thing we need to get our minds back on track and get our collective passion for radiation sciences kick-started again. So I look forward to seeing you all in Hawaii in October, and I wish you all the very best.
Thank you, Dr. Limoli. It looks like we don't really have any questions at this present time. Dr. Balch, if you have any closing comments?
Sure. Well, I was going to ask Charlie a question on behalf of some of the junior scientists out there. You know, people seem to go back and forth quite a bit about whether you really need preliminary data to be successful for one of the smaller grants like an R21. How do you feel about that? And how important is it to have a senior scientist on that when you're a junior scientist just starting out?
Well, that's a good point, Dr. Balch, and I think the latter part, having a senior scientist, is critical. If nothing else, it gives the reviewers confidence that you've really reached out and are prepared to bring in another expert to help your career move along. And look, I know that the R21 mechanism specifically doesn't require the preliminary data, but in almost every instance, if you do have preliminary data that's supportive, it's helpful. So I would, and you know, if you have 1 or 2 figures that support it, I mean, it can only help. So that's a good question.
Anybody else have some questions for Charlie?
Very good.
Well, there's one last. Yeah, you got it, Dr. Balch?
Yeah, so Tracy F is asking, if work doesn't fall obviously into one group, but maybe 2 possibilities, who do you talk to figure it out? That's a great question, because sometimes it is hard to get your grant to the correct study section. How do you do that? How do you figure it out?
So that's a perfect case where contacting the program officer is helpful. I can't speak to exactly, you know, what that would, you know, how to place your grant, Tracy, but your program officer can certainly give you guidance on how to steer a given application to the study section that you think has the requisite expertise to review your material. Oftentimes, it's as simple as changing a few words in the title. For example, if you really want RTB to review your grant, having radiation in the title is a damn good way to get it there. Simple, but maybe not so simple, I guess, or obvious, maybe not so obvious.
Okay, and another great question from Zach is, in this time of COVID-19, what do you know about the administrative supplements, or what might be out there to help people who are shut down right now? How do we survive?
Well, that's a good question, and unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that at my disposal. I have seen, at least circulating through a lot of the emails and websites, opportunities to get administrative supplements that are specific for shutdowns in the COVID. I just can't answer that right now, but that's a good question.
Okay, if anybody else has any questions, otherwise we'll let everybody go and enjoy the rest of their day.
All right. Well, listen, everyone, it's been a pleasure interacting with you all, and stay safe, and we'll get through this together. So best of luck to everyone.
Thanks, Charlie.
All righty.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Are we good, Jordan?
Yeah, we're good. There's one last question, if you wouldn't mind hopping on that one, actually. So it's, what is the realistic chance of a non-U.S. institution being successful at getting an NIH grant?
Unless you have a U.S. partner, I think it's unlikely. But hold this. Someone's ringing our doorbell, so I got to wrap this up quick.
No problem, sir.
So I would think, I think that's Jennifer. I think it's with a U.S. Partner. I think it's very possible, but just as a standalone, I don't know. That's a good question for a program officer. I'm not sure that there is a way a Canadian can get the funding for a U.S. grant.
All right. Well, on that note, Dr. Bosch and Dr. Limoli, thank you guys so much.
All right. Thanks for everybody who joined in with us today.
Yes, indeed. Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.